Early 19th century America was awash with new religious movements. I want to take some time to walk through a few of these with you as they also shape the landscape that we're considering. One of these sorts of movements we could put into the camp of utopianism. This is motivated by a sense of America as a new land, a new country, a new Israel even, in which new forms of religious life and even new sorts of revelations are possible. It's a sense of this breaking in of a new way, a new form of reality that draws energy out of some of the visions for this new American republic. One of the earliest examples of this is the Shaker movement. This is established by Mother Ann Lee in England in the middle of the 18th century. Mother Ann Lee claimed that she was the second incarnation of God, just as it was necessary for there to be a son of God, so it was also necessary for there to be a daughter of God. Mother Ann Lee preached celibacy as a sign of the coming of the kingdom of God. All property was held in common, as in keeping with the example of the apostles in the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. She and the movement promote female leadership and gender equality, and they also engage in all these various forms of ascetical practices. So there's no marriage, there's no forms of permitted sexual intercourse. There's no children in the community. So people join by visiting and observing, much as would have been the case in earlier monastic communities. So in a way, think of Shakerism as a kind of Protestant monastic movement, and with its own unique theology of the redemption of the entire human person by the redeeming of the gender divisions that exist within humanity, which in a way might be an echo from some of our very early considerations of gender as we reflected on them in the Gospel of Thomas. A second sort of religious movement would be apocalyptic. So both utopianism and apocalypticism ask, what is the new thing that God is doing? Utopianism says the new thing God is doing is establishing a new kind of community here on earth, which is a form of the breaking in of God's works of redemption. Whereas apocalypticism tends to say God is bringing things to an end, and there are signs all around us of how God is bringing things to an end. So the success of this new American Republic, it's liberating itself from the grips of tyranny under the King of England, led some to assume that the second coming of Jesus Christ was imminent. Again, this is a way of reading the United States as a kind of new Israel that then begins to assume that God has special concern for the United States above all other countries. And this is just a constant thread throughout American Protestant Christianity during this time period. One example of these sorts of Christian apocalyptic movements was William Miller, who in upstate New York predicts the return of Jesus Christ sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. On that latter date in 1844, he and his followers go up onto a hillside in upstate New York to await the return of Jesus Christ. That doesn't happen. The failure of that second coming leads some to label this event the Great Disappointment. And sometimes you'll find that phrase in various discussions of American religious movements. As often happens with apocalyptic movements, when they expect a specific event to happen and it doesn't, they tend to reorganize themselves. They often say, well, we didn't get the date right, or they give some other forms of explanation. Often it can lead to fracturing of movements. And so actually what came out of Miller's movement, or as they're called the Millerites, is the Seventh-day Adventist movement under the leadership of Ellen G. White, who is considered a prophet. The Seventh-day Adventist movement is fairly well established in certain parts of the United States. They have a specific emphasis on health and wellness and run a whole system of hospitals in certain parts of the country and the world. One of the branches off of the Seventh-day Adventist movement is a movement known as the Branch Davidian movement, and that is the movement that David Koresh came to lead that resulted in tragedy in Waco in the 1990s. So these movements, as some of you may be very aware of, are still alive and well in American Protestant Christianity. A third sort of movement is something known as the Restorationist movement. This is an attempt, whereas utopianism and apocalyptic look towards the new thing God is doing, restorationists in many ways want to return to the pure ways of the early church. They want to seek the kind of primitive nature of early Christianity. So we have two different branches here we can consider. One is a movement led by Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. This is sometimes referred to as the Stone-Campbell movement. They attend the Cane Ridge Revival of 1804. And one of the things that sticks with them after is seeing all these different kinds of Protestant Christianity. And they think the diversity of Christianity is in itself a scandal. And so they want to restore Christianity back to the forms of what they call the primitive church. Primitive here does not mean backwards, rather it means original, pure, the way God intends it to be. So this is this notion of restoring back to the primitive church is how we get the phrase restorationist movement. And so the emphasis here is on a clear interpretation of the biblical text, and a careful attention to it is what helps establish, create, sustain the apostolic nature of the church. So apostolicity is very important here. The goals of the Restorationist movement include establishing the parameters for Christian freedom. That is to make sure that Christians can worship according to what Scripture says and not according to what the dictates of various denominations say. Through that way, really trying to break down denominationalism, and so to create a kind of global Protestant Christian unity. And by achieving that unity, they in their own way would hasten the second coming of Jesus Christ. So this concern about where Christ is and when will Christ return, again, very much in the mix for restorationist movements. The restorationist movements culminate, ironically, in denominations such as Church of Christ is one, or sometimes called the Christian Church is another branch, or Disciples of Christ. Those are all different variations that come out of the Stone-Campbell movement. Alongside this, another kind of restorationist movement is Joseph Smith's movement that leads to the establishment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith in 1830, again in upstate New York, publishes a document he calls the Book of Mormon, which he says is based on revelations he's received from the angel Moroni and from gold tablets that have been that he's been able to discover. Here, he develops these restorationist ideas of reestablishing the original church, which had been already existence in America through the migration, he claimed, of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, or portions of them at least, to North America. And to them, Jesus Christ had appeared, and they had become believers during the periods between Christ's resurrection and ascension. And so here we have the restorationist ideals really strongly fusing with this American Protestant assumption that America is a new Israel. But what Smith really is claiming is it's not just that America is the new Israel. In some ways, America has always been Israel. And so this powerful narrative of the United States as God's chosen place has these really strong strands in the Latter-day Saints movement. A few words about the establishment of the Church of Latter-day Saints, because they are so uniquely an American form of Christianity, is in order. In 1839, a temple is built in Nauvoo, Illinois. There is an attempt to establish an independent government from the United States there and to create a utopian community. So utopianism also threads into this movement. As we're seeing, these are all movements, not just discrete denominations in a way. In 1844, Joseph Smith is killed. Brigham Young becomes its leader. They migrate in 1847 to the Utah territory. They have kind of elaborate negotiations with the U.S. federal government around this. And there they begin to build up, in their minds, a new Jerusalem in order to prepare for the second coming of Jesus Christ around the Salt Lake territory. So again, we see with the Latter-day Saints movement, utopianism, apocalypticism, and restorationism all mingling and fusing together to create this really uniquely American form of Protestantism. This is one significant trajectory. In this narrative, I've been paying a lot of attention to people that we could identify as Euro-American. It's also, of course, important to keep our eye on what's happening with the African-American religious experience. As I've already narrated, they are significant players in the Protestant Christian discourse that is happening in the United States. And part of what's happening is that there's a movement happening from Christian religion being imposed on enslaved Africans to African-American Christians developing their own religious bodies and developing their own forms of leadership emerging out of that. One of the important things to see is after the American Revolution, free African Americans organized their own congregations, particularly in northern cities like Philadelphia and New York. There is significant energy around this. So let's take the city of Philadelphia as one prominent example. There is a significant African American community in the Philadelphia area under the leadership of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. These two African American leaders had helped organize free Africans into civil service groupings, and they tended to congregate for worship at St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. What happens at St. George's is that as the free African-American population grows, the white leadership at St. George's becomes very nervous about this and creates segregated seating. So they need to sit up in a balcony that's been built especially for them. On the day when this policy is enacted, there's a confrontation. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen go to the front, to their usual seats. The ushers tell them they can't stay there, and when they refuse, they are forcibly ejected from the church. This leads to Absalom Jones helping to establish an independent, or rather a new Episcopal church congregation known as St. Thomas's African Church, with the assistance of Bishop William White of Philadelphia. Absalom Jones is ordained as a deacon in 1795, and in 1804, he's ordained as a priest. I have a lot more of this narrative about Jones and Allen to share that we'll unpack more of in our Episcopal Church history course. Richard Allen also has an important trajectory in his own right. He works with others to establish the African Methodist Episcopal Church, known as AME. around the same time in New York City, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church is founded by James Varick. These two different entities, AME and AME Zion, are the first denominations established by Black people in the United States for Black people, and are important means by which Black folk exercise their agency and self-determination in the United States. Not just in religious matters, but also it seeps over into civil matters. Again, I'm going to pack some more of this as we get into the material in Episcopal Church history. But it's also important to note, as I said before, the ways in which religious life both cuts across class boundaries, racial boundaries, but also gender boundaries. And a great example of this is the example of Jarena Lee, who in the African Methodist Episcopal Church is the first woman who is ordained. Indeed, the first ordained woman that we know of in any form of American Protestantism. She is converted by hearing the preaching of Richard Allen. And I would like to read some of her experience of experiencing conversion and then sanctification. So again, this is in the Griffith book. I'm looking here on page 203. So in the bottom of 203, she again, much like Finney, is described in this way in which she puts herself into a private space in which she can pray and meditate before God. So about 5 lines down, she says, when I rose from my knees, so she's been praying for a long time and she's been struggling in prayer. When I rose from my knees, there seemed a voice speaking to me as I yet stood in a leaning posture. And it said, ask for sanctification. When to my surprise, I recollected that I had not even thought of it in my whole prayer. It would seem Satan had hidden the very object from my mind for which I purposely kneeled to pray. So remember when we talked about Methodism from our previous unit, sanctification is really that process of moving into holiness once one has had that justifying experience of conversion, which she already has from having heard the preaching of Richard Allen. So she goes on, but when his voice whispered in my heart saying, pray for sanctification, I again bowed in the same place at the same time and said, Lord, sanctify my soul for Christ's sake. That very instant, as if lightning had darted through me, I sprang to my feet and cried, the Lord has sanctified my soul. There was none to hear us but the angels who stood around to witness my joy, and Satan, whose malice raged the more. That Satan was there I knew, for no sooner had I cried out, the Lord has sanctified my soul, there seemed to be another voice behind me saying, no, it's too great a work to be done. But another spirit said, bow down for the witness. I received it. Thou art sanctified. The first I knew of myself after that, I was standing in the yard with my hands spread out and looking with my face toward heaven. So here are so many amazing markers of a conversion experience here. This praying intensely, this instantaneously and graciously receiving a gift, and even this form of struggling with spirits and having experience of being brought in a way in a trial and coming out the other side in this trial, and then this physical manifestations of electricity and of disorientation, but then a sense of fullness of change. Jarena Lee is convinced after this conversion experience of how she is called to preach as a result of this. And she goes before Richard Allen and kind of needs to be able to explain why she's called to preach. And Allen is suspicious, but also consents when he hears this testimony from her about it. So again, to just wrap up this section, on page 205, at the very bottom, she talks about, at the very top of 205, rather, she talks about this way in which she tries to justify the validity of her preaching. She says, oh, how careful ought we to be, lest through our bylaws of church government and discipline, we bring into disrepute even the word of life. For as seemly as it may appear nowadays for a woman to preach, it should be remembered that nothing is impossible with God. And why should it be thought impossible, heterodox, or improper for a woman to preach, seeing the Savior died for the woman as well as the man? And so we see here her justification for her preaching mission that is itself scripturally rooted. That is that God dies for all, or Christ dies for all, and God justifies all. And so both the man and the woman can continue the work of Jesus Christ. And so this appeal to scriptural teaching then is a piece of Jarena Lee's participation in a wider evangelical discourse, much as the AME movement itself is located within that wider evangelical discourse. And this might help us just think about where evangelical Protestantism is going as a movement here in the 19th century. And there's two trajectories that we're going to want to keep an eye on. One is an emphasis on personal morality over social change. And that's going to be a very traditionalist argument and movement. We're going to see this unpack as we move into the fundamentalist controversy of the early 20th century. Another trajectory is going to actually emphasize social change as a mark of how personal morality affects people around you. And this develops into what we're going to call later mainline Protestantism and its embrace of the social gospel movement, which again is an issue that we're going to see unpack more in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So a lot is happening in Protestant Christianity in this time period in the 19th century. This all serves as a prelude for thinking about how American Christianity grapples with its greatest sin and challenge, which is the existence of slavery as a system of exploitation in the United States.